Saudi Arabia is trying to build the future, not metaphorically, literally. Right now, in the middle of the desert, construction crews are carving out the foundations for something called The Line, a city that looks less like a normal city and more like concept art from a sci-fi movie that accidentally got $1 trillion budget. 2 mirrored walls, 170 kilometers long, 500 meters tall. No cars, no streets, no suburbs. Just millions of people stacked inside a single linear structure stretching across the desert. And somehow, this is real. Or at least, it's supposed to become real. The project sits inside a massive region called NEOM, Saudi Arabia's attempt to build an entirely new economic future for itself before oil stops being enough. Depending on which estimate you believe, the total cost could end up somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion, which is an absurd amount of money. That's larger than the GDP of many countries. And here's the strange part. The biggest question isn't whether Saudi Arabia can build it. The country has money, engineers, political power. It can build massive things very quickly when it wants to. The real question is harder than that. Even if they finish it, will people actually want to live there? Because cities aren't engineering projects, they're human behavior projects, and humans are messy. Most cities don't begin as master plans. They grow slowly. A port becomes a town becomes a trade hub becomes a city. That's how London happened, New York happened, Tokyo happened. Nobody sat in a room 300 years ago and said, all right guys, let's design 8 million people. Cities usually evolve by accident. The Line is trying to skip that process entirely. Everything is planned in advance. Transportation, energy, food systems, housing, climate control, even the way people are supposed to move through daily life. And honestly, some of it sounds incredible. A high-speed rail system running underneath the structure, vertical farms inside the city itself, schools, offices, parks, hospitals, all reachable within minutes without needing a car. If you've ever sat in traffic for 2 hours just to buy groceries and get home, parts of this sound amazing. That's why the project gets attention. It's not just architecture porn, it's selling an idea. What if cities didn't have to suck this much? But then reality enters the conversation. Because building one futuristic building is hard enough. Building an entire functioning civilization from zero is something else entirely. The numbers here stop feeling real very quickly. The Line wants to eventually hold 9 million residents. For comparison, New York City took centuries to become New York City. The Line wants to compress that process into a few decades, inside one building, in the desert. And this is where engineers start getting nervous. Not because the individual technologies are impossible. High-speed rail exists, smart infrastructure exists, vertical farming exists. The problem is scale. Nobody has ever tried combining all of this at the same time, at this size, in this environment. The structure would have to deal with brutal desert heat, wind pressure, sandstorms, energy demand, water supply, cooling systems, transportation flow, waste management, continuously, every day, for millions of people. A normal city can fail in sections. A city built like a machine has a different problem. When one system breaks, everything feels it. And there's another layer people don't talk about enough, the human cost of building it. Saudi Arabia has already faced criticism over migrant labor conditions connected to NEOM-related construction. Members of the local Huaytat tribe reportedly resisted displacement orders tied to the project. Human rights organizations raised concerns. International headlines followed. Because behind every futuristic render, there are still workers pouring concrete in desert heat. That part tends to disappear from the trailers. Now here's where the whole thing becomes weirdly ironic. NEOM exists because Saudi Arabia knows oil won't last forever. That's the entire point. Vision 2030, the national strategy behind all of this, is basically Saudi Arabia looking at the future and saying, we can't stay dependent on oil forever. And honestly, that concern is real. The kingdom understands something a lot of resource economies eventually discover. If your entire system depends on one thing, your future becomes fragile. So Saudi Arabia is trying to reinvent itself. Tourism, technology, finance, entertainment, sports, infrastructure. And NEOM is supposed to become the symbol of that transformation. But here's the catch. The thing funding this transformation is still oil. That's where the tension is. Every time oil prices fall, these megaprojects suddenly become much harder to justify, and reports already suggest parts of the Line may have been scaled down from the original timeline, which makes sense, because once you leave the world of normal construction and enter the world of trillion-dollar experimentation, small economic changes become gigantic problems. And megaprojects have a habit of looking unstoppable, right until they suddenly aren't. But honestly, none of that is the biggest risk. The biggest risk is demand, because people don't move somewhere just because the buildings look cool. That's not how cities work. People move for opportunity, for culture, for energy, for networks, for other people. That's why cities like New York, London, Singapore, or Tokyo became powerful in the first place. Not because somebody designed a perfect building, because millions of unpredictable human decisions slowly stacked on top of each other over time. The Line is attempting the reverse. Build the structure first, hope human behavior follows later. And maybe it will, but that's still a gamble. Especially when the target audience, wealthy professionals, entrepreneurs, global talent, already has options. A software engineer can live in Singapore. A startup founder can move to Dubai. A designer can choose Berlin. An investor can pick London. So Saudi Arabia isn't competing against empty desert. It's competing against every functioning global city on Earth. And that's much harder. There's also something psychologically strange about NEOM. A lot of the project exists right now more as imagery than reality. Perfect renders, perfect lighting, perfect greenery, perfect people smiling inside mirrored skyscrapers in the desert. It looks incredible, but renders are easy. Cities are hard. Eventually, every mega project reaches the same moment. The moment the marketing collides with real life. And that gap matters, because trust is built inside that gap. If the finished version feels dramatically smaller, emptier, harsher, or less magical than the world people were sold, perception changes very quickly. And perception matters a lot when your project depends on attracting global talent and global investment, especially for a city trying to convince the world that it represents the future. Honestly, maybe partially. That's probably the real answer. A smaller version of the Line could still happen. Parts of NEOM could genuinely succeed. Saudi Arabia could still create major economic growth around the Red Sea region, and even partial success would still be historically massive. But the original vision, 9 million people living inside a perfectly integrated linear city in the desert, that's where things become uncertain. Because the hardest part of building cities was never concrete. It was always people. People are irrational. People form habits. People cluster unpredictably. People want chaos, culture, spontaneity, history, identity. Real cities are slightly messy. That's usually how you know they're alive. And maybe that's the hidden tension at the center of the Line. The project feels less like a city and more like an attempt to engineer human life itself. Maybe that works. Maybe it doesn't. But one way or another, Saudi Arabia is about to find out something very expensive. You can design buildings from scratch. Designing human civilization is much harder.